Sounds like an advertisement. Oh, I need an eraser. Oh, here it is.
Okay, Margarita. I think we're good to go.
All right, tell me when.
Right now.
Welcome back. Today we are recording the class. So I am not available for you to send questions during class. It's actually morning here, and tonight we will broadcast this. Is that right? We're going to broadcast it? Okay. But next week we will be back live and in real time. So I want to remind you that there was homework due next week. That means I would like you to email your homework to me this week, sometime between now and next Wednesday, so that I can read them and choose some ideas to share in class Thursday. So here is the homework. Write 1 or 2 paragraphs, as much as you want, explaining Levis's argument so far. Try to write in English if you can, but Portuguese is okay. Or you can mix the two. The main idea is to look back and remember what Levis is talking about, what he has said from the beginning, and try to express what you have understood of the argument thus far. I think it is important for us to do this exercise right now because the book is complicated and we don't want to forget what we are talking about. So let's remind ourselves of what the main points are. And we will have some of the students' writing shared in class next week, possibly with some English notes drawn out of student writing. Also, while I have this up on the board, I wanted to show you something that is easily mistaken by English speakers, native speakers, about punctuation. Just happens to be in this assignment. I may have told you this before, but many people make mistakes. This word, that's the name Levis. Putting this apostrophe made it possessive. Usually, when we make something possessive, we add an apostrophe S. Levis's. If the word itself ends in S, then we put the apostrophe after the S, but we don't add another S. However, we continue to pronounce the additional S. So when I read this, I said 1 or 2 paragraphs explaining Levis's argument. So in writing, it just says Levis argument. But in pronunciation, we say Levis's argument. That is a peculiarity that many Americans miss. Some people will write it this way and read it this way, explaining Levis' argument. That is incorrect. And many people will write it this way just because they know that when they pronounce it, it sounds like Levis's. So both ways are incorrect. You actually write it like this and pronounce it like this. And that goes only for words that end in an S, not for words that end in the sibilant sounds. Most of our words that have peculiarities like this, it would apply to all of the sibilant sounds like F, ch, z, etc. But with this particular rule, it only applies to words ending in S. Okay? Since I had that up, I thought I'd point it out. I don't think there's anything else, except I want to remind you, the homework is due before the next class, preferably before Wednesday, so that we will have time to look at it before class. Okay. Now, today we are recording the class, so you cannot ask questions during class. But I hope you will ask questions and email them. That way I can address the questions next week. If there is anything in the English or in the grammar or in the spelling, pronunciation, anything that you want to ask about, please ask. Because otherwise, if you don't ask, I will not know what specific constructions seem difficult to you or don't make sense. So please send questions if you have any. And I have one question from last week. Actually, it's not about this book. I'll read you the question. The student writes that she has been reading a book called How to Speak and How to Listen by Mortimer J. Adler. And on page 254, there is a quote which has a construction she does not recognize. The quote says, according to John Locke. I'll write it. According to John Locke, a man is free when he obeys a law established by a government to which he has given his consent. I'm going to shorten the word government to contracted form. And in the making of which law. He has exercised a voice through suffrage. The question is, what does this expression mean? I wrote this quote up because I really like the quote. I like the sentiment. I appreciate the beauty of the writing. It's, for me, very clear, crystal clear in its construction. It's beautifully written, and it's a good question too. So let's look at this quote. Okay, according to John Locke, a man is free when he obeys a law established by a government to which he has given his consent, and in the making of which law he has exercised a voice through suffrage. Now, the root of the sentence is, a man is free when he obeys a law. Now, in the on the face of it, that sounds like a contradiction, because, at least in America, we tend to think that law constricts a man and restricts his freedom and limits him, and that he is free insofar as he throws off of law, just like a horse is free when he does not have a bit and a bridle and a saddle and reins. When all of that is taken off the horse, he is free to run on the field. And bring him in, put on a halter, insert a bit, and steer him, he is no longer free. So we tend to think that a man is free when he does not obey a law. But the opposite is being said here. I personally love the idea of freedom through the obedience to divine law. But that's not about the English. That's just me. But let's look here. A man is free when he obeys a law. What kind of law? There are two modifying ideas, concepts, sentiments. The first is this one. A law which has been established by a government to which he has given his consent. So, given his consent modifies government. And then established by a government modifies law. So we are talking about a man giving his consent to a government, which then makes a law, which he obeys. So you have a progression. He gives his consent to the government, which makes the law, which he then obeys. And the order is reversed in the sentence with given his consent, which is really chronologically the first thing, is last. So we have the construction to which is a way of putting a modifier that really should be before, after. Okay? This allows you to take something that happened first and put it last in the sentence. So the order, the chronology is reversed here. He is free when he obeys the law, which is the last thing, which was established by a government, which was the second thing, to which he has given his consent, first thing. Now, in the second clause, so it's that kind of a law, established by a government, which he has consented to. Also, it is a law in the making of which, and he puts in law here unnecessarily, just to clarify in case you couldn't follow him. It's not necessary. He didn't have to even use this word. He could have just said, in the making of which, the way he says to which up here. He doesn't say a government to which government he has given his consent. In the same way, we don't need of which law. We don't need it. But he put it in just in case the reader was not clear. So, in the making of which law, he has exercised a voice through suffrage. So, suffrage means voting. So he voted for a representative. In our legal system, in our governmental system, we have a representative democracy. Republic, but representative. So this person maybe is a congressman or a senator. Okay, this is a representative. So he voted. He exercised a voice to make the law. Okay, so this is the same kind of construction where the first thing the man did was vote, suffrage. That was number one. He voted for the man or woman that he thought would make the laws that he would approve of. He voted for the man or woman who represented his views. He had the opportunity to exercise a voice through suffrage. So, number one, he voted. Number two, the law was made. In the making of which. So, this construction, which the student did not understand, is functionally equivalent to this construction. Basically, these two serve the same function. They allow something which happened earlier to come later in the sentence. A simple sentence would say, the man voted for the representative who made a law which he obeyed. But because we are inverting the order, we need special grammatical constructions. And this is one of them. And this is the same. And the reason they needed in the making of which is because they are trying to say a law which was made by a representative. And he's trying to preserve this kind of a construction, to which, in the making of which. So he didn't have to use this construction. He used it in order to be parallel. And that's part of the beauty of this quote. It's very well written. And it's easy to understand because the first clause, which I have bracketed in green, establishes a pattern that the mind can follow for the second clause. So we have The man is free when he obeys a law. And we have an inverted chronology established by a government to which he has given his consent. So he obeys, government, consent, and then it's obey, the making of which law he exercised a voice through suffrage. So anyway, to make a long story short and to give you a very long answer for a very short question, this phrase is the same as this phrase, and we have inserted this clause because the concept is an active one, the making of the law, rather than, the whole phrase, he has given his consent, is also. So anyway, it just is needful for the concept, the making of the law. But really, the whole phrase is functionally equivalent to just to which it is a grammatical construction which enables a writer to invert the order and to put something at the end of the sentence which really might have come before as a modifier of something that came earlier. So anyway, I hope that's clear. I really like this quote. I think it's beautifully written, and I like the idea quite a bit. If there's any more questions, stop the tape right now and write me a question, because this isn't real time. So you can write a question right now if you want. I really like it when you write questions. It reminds me that someone is out there. Okay, let us go back to our study. Let's see, where are we? We are on page 27. And the last thing we read, I believe we were reading about the fact that Levis thinks Andreski has an inconsistency in his thought. If you remember correctly, there was a dichotomy. There was science on the one hand and morality or ethics on the other hand. And science deals with what is. Morality and ethics deal with what ought to be. Ought to be. I made that wrong. Ought to be. The laws of science are the laws of nature. And things naturally obey them. The laws of nature describe the behavior of largely inanimate objects. Inanimate means objects that are not alive, per se. They are rocks, atoms, light, energy, etc. So natural laws describe the behavior of these objects, and the objects obey the laws of nature naturally. They obey them consistently and naturally. So they obey. We don't even want to, you have to put obey in quotation marks because it's not voluntary obedience. So they can't disobey. So this word may not be a good word, but they obey the laws naturally. On the other hand, we have morality, which describes what ought to be. These are the laws of, you could say, the laws of God, or some sort of abstract standard. This is a moral standard which must be agreed upon mutually, or else the law doesn't exist at all in the people's mind. It's not something which is observed necessarily. It does not describe the behavior, the natural behavior of people. It prescribes the behavior. It prescribes behavior. Now, this word prescribe, I want to say something about from an English perspective. Prescribe means lay down the law. Tell people what to do. Do this, don't do that. Prescribe tells you what you should do. We have some other words that are closely related. One closely related word is proscribe. Proscribe means to forbid. Proscribe means to tell you you are not allowed to do that, to outlaw something. Okay? Prescribe is to tell you what to do and what not to do. Proscribe is just the negative. This behavior is proscribed. It is not allowed. We also have a word, ascribe. And that means to believe and say that an entity has a certain quality, like we ascribe glory to God. Or I could use it in a sentence, everybody ascribed to me the motive of courage for rescuing that child when really I was very scared and in a panic. You know, they ascribe motivations to me or some quality. And of course we also have the word describe, which is actually right here as opposed to prescribe. Describe means to look at what is and to explain it. So when you are describing, you are not judging or evaluating. You are only a mirror. You see what is and you express it. Whereas with prescribe, you're telling them what it should be. Okay, so we have lots of words having to do with this same root. Okay, so on this side we have morality prescribes behavior which is actually unnatural when you come down to it. Unnatural behavior. Natural man does not obey the laws of morality, and natural man must be exhorted. Now here we get to the words that Andruski uses. Natural man must be exhorted to do the right thing, to avoid vice. vice is the proscribed behavior. There is no exhortation on this side of the whiteboard. There is only description. But Andreski also used the word preach. So Andreski is asserting himself to be on this side of the board with science and logic and natural laws and all this, but he is using words like exhortation and preach, and really, actually, he seems to be on this side, as he tells his colleagues that they ought not falsify data. They ought not bring prejudice and bias into their scientific literature. So why not? Andreski has no basis for his exhortations, for his, for what he is telling them to do, for the vices he is exposing, except moral ones. So there is inconsistency. Now that is where we ended last week, and I will pick up from the last full paragraph, beginning with the words, "There are grounds," on page 27. And the sense he is talking about is the sense that Andreski is inconsistent in his thoughts. Okay, that's the sense that Levis is talking about in the first sentence. There are grounds for such a sense. They lend themselves best to consideration in Andreski's chapter 8, Evasion in the Guise of Objectivity. They don't seriously impair the book for Andreski's avowed purpose, but in a way that can be profitably taken as a challenge, they entail issues in relation to values and standards, about which anyone concerned to enforce the contention that English should stand for a discipline of thought needs to be clear in his mind, articulate, and tactically ready. Now, we did read that last week, so unless you have questions about any constructions in there, I'll continue and move on. Andreski's chapter opens. The distinction between a judgment of fact and a judgment of value has become one of the cornerstones of philosophy ever since Hume wrote his famous statement that reason is and must always remain the slave of passions. Though beset by the difficulties of application, due above all to the shading off of concepts into one another, this distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. Let's stop there for a minute. The distinction, I'm moving back and rereading the beginning of the quote. The distinction between a judgment of fact and a judgment of value has become one of the cornerstones of philosophy. Judgment of fact versus judgment of value fits very nicely into the dichotomy we already have on the board. This would be the side for judgment of fact, and this would be the side for judgment of value. The distinction, meaning the fact that they are separate and not overlapped, that they're easily separated and distinct from one another. So the fact that they are distinct has become one of the cornerstones of philosophy. Has become implies that this is recent and that classical philosophy did not make this distinction, or at least did not emphasize it. And it's one of the cornerstones. A cornerstone is a support, foundation stone. The Lord Jesus Christ has been called the cornerstone. He's also been compared to the capstone. But cornerstone is very important as a foundation. Also, I'm not completely sure. Perhaps this actually means capstone. I remember when I studied architecture, and maybe some of you know more than I about this, that there was a way of doing the structure like this. And I may be wrong about this. This is up. This would be a ceiling or a roof. And in order for it all to hold together, you had to have just the right stone here. Because this one was holding it all together, applying the force in both directions. That was the cornerstone, as I remember biblical architecture. So, at any rate, cornerstone of philosophy. If you don't have the cornerstone, the entire edifice will fall. Okay? Cornerstone. So, this distinction is the cornerstone. I believe you know that Olavo disagrees strenuously with the idea that this distinction perhaps even exists. Am I right? Yeah, Olavo doesn't believe it exists. And I think perhaps Levis doesn't either. But Andreski does. Andreski is the author of this quote: "The distinction between a judgment of fact and a judgment of value has become one of the cornerstones of philosophy ever since Hume wrote in his famous statement that reason is and must always remain the slave of the passions." Now, if reason is the slave of the passions, then I am not a philosopher, and I haven't studied very much. But it seems to me, and maybe Alessandra will correct me if I'm mistaken, if reason is the slave of the passions, then this side is subordinated to this side. In other words, and I don't mean the morality, I mean, at this point I'm talking about subjective. This being considered objective, outside of ourselves, objective, versus subjective. Which is something that exists as thoughts within my own head. Now, I personally do not believe that morality and ethics are essentially subjective in the sense that they exist only in our heads. I do not believe that. I believe that morality and ethics are, in fact, outside of ourselves, that they are part of God. That's what I believe. However, in the argument we're talking about within philosophy, apparently the idea is that that which is objective outside of ourselves is subordinated to that which is subjective. If that is the case, then these observations are not reliable. Am I right about my reasoning? So, if Andreski believes that the judgment of fact, objectivity, reason, is the slave of subjectivity, then I see that as a great inconsistency in his argument, because his whole argument was that all this is objective and that it's reliable and that it ought to be reliable. So to me, this is absurd. It seems to me. But I am not a philosopher, so maybe I'm wrong. But at any rate, that is what the English book is saying. It is saying that Andreski says that philosophy relies on the concept that the objective is the slave to the subjective. And then Andreski goes on. This ... in the book, ... right here, ... means that Levis is cutting out part of the quote. So we don't know what Andreski's argument was, but he continues with, though beset by the difficulties of application, due above all to the shading off of concepts into one another, this distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. I don't have a lot of respect for this sentence myself. If the ideal of objectivity, the best we can get, the one that we would hope for, is subordinated to the subjective, that doesn't sound good to me. Also, it says, though beset by the difficulties of application. Now, I'm afraid we will have to erase.
Margarita,
Yes.
before you move on, some questions concerning vocabulary.
Okay.
Beset
Yes.
and shading off.
Okay. Alessandro has pointed out a couple of questions of vocabulary. The word beset and the phrase shading off. I'll go ahead. I think I would like to try to perhaps define them in context. So, but I will define those. And if you have any other questions of vocabulary, email, and we'll talk about them next week. And Alessandro, please keep pointing these out as we go today. Okay. Though beset by the difficulties of application, this distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. Okay. The core of the sentence is, this distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. Okay, so the core of the sentence, this distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. Okay, if we take this core without the modifying phrases and just look at it, we see it says, this distinction, the objectivity, subjectivity, judgment of fact, judgment of value, distinction. Fact, value, objective, subjective, etc. This distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. So what he is saying is, it would be good for us, human beings, to embrace the understanding, the self-knowledge that our perceptions are subjective, and that our subjective perceptions are a filter for our ability to perceive the objective world. And that the world exists out there. When it comes in through the filter of our senses, it takes a new form in our mind, and that new form is a subjective reality. And that these two are different, and that what we can see within our mind on the screen of our brain, I see a tree, on my optic nerve is the tree, and I am seeing something in my mind. What I see in my mind is not what is there. What I see in my mind is something different, and I have attached value to it, and I have changed it and modified it. It's essentially different than what is out there. Now, he is saying that for me to understand that and to realize that I have no direct access to the objective world, that I cannot know the objective world, that for me to realize this is part of being objective, that I must, if I am a sophisticated philosopher and a wise and thinking person, I must mistrust my own perspectives because they are not essentially connected with reality. This is what this sentence means, if I'm not mistaken. Do you agree? Yeah. I'm checking with Alessandro because I think he maybe knows more about philosophy than I know. I am only analyzing the words, as far as I can tell. But anyway, now we go to the modifiers. Though beset by the difficulties of application. Okay, here we have the word beset. Beset. This is an unusual word. You do not hear it very often in common speech. When I have heard it, I hear it in religion in the phrase besetting sins. A besetting sin is a sin that troubles me my whole life long. I repent, I try to amend my life, and it comes back. It besets me. It keeps coming back. I can also imagine this word in the context of being attacked by a pack of dogs who are snapping at me from many directions and persisting. They keep at me. It implies that it's coming and coming and coming over a long period of time. It is negative. There is nothing that besets you which is good. It's inherently negative, and it means something that is troubling you and worrying you and attacking you repeatedly forever. It has the duration concept. Without termination, something you really cannot overcome finally. Okay, so, though beset by the difficulties of application. Okay, beset by the difficulties of application. I'm going to rewrite it so I have room. Beset by the difficulties let us think about how that phrase modifies and affects the main sentence. First of all, though means in spite of. In spite of. In spite of the difficulties of application, the distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. Now remember, this core sentence means it is good to embrace this distinction if we want to be objective. And objective means good. Objective is what we want here. Okay. So if we value objectivity, it is good to embrace this value, this distinction, which underlies it. Although, though beset by the difficulties of application. Difficulties of application means that you cannot apply this. Now, Olavo points out that this idea cannot be applied in real life. It is useless. If you tell a person they cannot know reality, what good is it? Well, let's give up. If we cannot know, why try? And if we cannot know, how do you know that we cannot know? This is a circular argument which is absurd. If knowledge is impossible, then the knowledge that knowledge is impossible is impossible. It's like a room of mirrors that go back forever. You cannot make the statement that we cannot know something because it is a flawed instrument. If what you're saying is true, then the instrument that said it doesn't know. So, beset by difficulties of application. Andreski understands that this distinction will be beset by difficulties of application. In other words, he may as well say, this would be a functional equivalent. Though this idea is absurd, the distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. He may as well say that when he says, though beset by difficulties of application. He needs this word though to negate the force of this. The force of this is that the concept cannot be easily applied. Maybe it cannot be applied at all. It doesn't work. It doesn't work logically. It is beset by trouble. But, although it is beset by trouble, yet it is true. See, though negates all this in favor of this. Or you could see it as this implies an outcome which this does not conclude. I've explained the word though before in that way, that this word precedes a phrase which would make you think a certain conclusion would be drawn, comma, and then something with a different conclusion is stated. That's when we use the word though. So, though beset by difficulties of application means that although this distinction can't really work, and Olavo has taught about this, if I'm not mistaken, about how difficult it is to apply this concept. Okay, so though beset by difficulties of application, the distinction underlies the ideal. Okay, though beset by difficulties of application, due, above all, to the shading off of concepts into one another. Okay, now we'll talk about the shading off of concepts into one another. I really hate to erase here, because all of these things need to go together in the end. But I think I will. I'll redraw it. Okay. Though beset by difficulties of application, due to refers it back to this. Okay. Due above all to, above all. The above all isn't really very necessary. Due above all to the shading off, right, of concepts into one another. Okay, though beset by difficulties of application. Why is it beset by difficulties of application? Because due above all means there's lots of problems. But the main one that the difficulties of application are due to is due to the shading off of concepts into one another. This distinction underlines the ideal. Okay, the distinction is fact, subjective value. Shading off of concepts into one another means that things overlap. They are not delineated with a sharp line like this. In fact, they're more like this. Concepts. Okay, everything is in both categories. You've got fact and value everywhere. All the perceptions we have, all of the ruminations, all of the thoughts, all of the feelings, all of the, a feeling, it has a basis in interactions that are outside of yourself. It also has a basis in subjective context of your mind and your background and experience. Your witness of if you see something happen, there's a basis in fact, and there's a basis in your spin. You could see someone murder someone, and you would be horrified, and you would say, I saw him murder that person. And then later you might find out that it was staged. They were actors, and they were, in fact, friends and playing a game for a camera. And then you're like, oh, I didn't see someone murder each other. There's fact and there's values in everything. So, this is another layer of absurdity, in my opinion, onto this sentence. Okay, remember, the core sentence is this distinction, the sharp fact value distinction, which is the cornerstone of objectivity, supposedly. This distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity, although it is beset by difficulties of application, meaning You can't apply it. Why? Because everything is shaded off into each other. In other words, because there is no distinction. In other words, this line as a sharp, clear delineation, as a sharp, clear distinction, does not exist. So we have a sentence that basically says, though beset by difficulties of application, due above all to the shading off of concepts into one another, the distinction between fact and value underlies the ideal of objectivity. Personally, I have no respect for this concept, this sentence, now that we've studied it, which I studied it this morning. That's why I started this portion of the class with the phrase, I don't respect this. So, okay, let us continue. This is now Levis talking about Andreski's quote. Actually, and I'm beginning on page 28 with the word actually, first full paragraph. Actually, do you remember what I said about the function of actually? Generally, actually means what was said before is not right. What is right is following. Okay, so actually, it has an emotional connotation of, I don't want to be too strong, but it almost makes you feel like the person is saying, you idiot, can't you see? Actually, what is actually true should be obvious to you, but it wasn't, so I'll tell you. So actually is a term that introduces a section where you're going to disagree and try to show that your position is obvious and correct. Actually, the ideal of objectivity cannot be what Andreski represents it as being. And if the distinction, as he posits it, is one of the cornerstones of philosophy, then it is certainly imprudent to commit oneself to living in the edifice. Human Russell, a philosopher whom he adduces with avowed sympathy, are not sufficient authorities regarding the nature of objectivity, and the student of English ought to be able to say so with well-founded conviction. And I have a quote from Olavo written in my margin. Olavo said, "A well-taught student can criticize Hume and Russell." In other words, a well-taught student is able to criticize Hume and Russell, and it is appropriate for them to do so. Hume and Russell are not God and the Bible. We are allowed to disagree. Let us look at this paragraph a little more closely. This, I wish I could come up with the right word. I was trying to get the word when I was speaking of the word actually. Levis is poking fun at Andreski here. Levis is sort of making a fool of Andreski's. He's not showing much respect for this. Let's read it. Actually, the ideal of objectivity cannot be what Andreski represents it as being. So, Andreski is showing forth that the ideal of objectivity is to understand that our perspectives are subjective and that what is objective is beyond our reach. We cannot know it, and we hold this in our mind whenever we speak. That is how Andreski puts forth the ideal of objectivity. Levis says it cannot be that. And if the distinction as he posits it posit means puts it forth, suggests. As he suggests, he puts it forth. If this distinction is one of the cornerstones of philosophy, then it is certainly imprudent. Imprudent means if you are thinking of the future and toward your safety and security, you are being prudent. If you are not thinking of your safety and security, you are being imprudent. Okay? So, if the distinction, as he posits it, is one of the cornerstones of philosophy, then it is certainly imprudent to commit oneself to living in the edifice. Remember, edifice is a building. Remember what I showed you about cornerstone, capstone, and how the cornerstone holds it all together? And if the cornerstone is not good, the whole thing will fall down on your head. The whole thing will fall on your head. So, you do not want to commit yourself. Commit yourself means make a promise to yourself that you will stay permanently. So you don't want to commit your heart to this conception of objectivity or even of philosophy. Because if you do, this thing will turn to dust. The whole philosophical house will fall on your head. So, if this is true, you're in trouble if you're committing yourself. Hume and Russell, a philosopher whom he adduces with avowed sympathy. Remember the word adduce. It means to bring forth as evidence. So, Andreski brings forth Russell's concepts as proof. Okay, he adduces him, he brings him forth as proof. With avowed sympathy. Sympathy, in its most common usage, means pity. It means, I feel sorry for you. You are in a bad way. I feel your pain. I have sympathy for you. But it has a second usage, which he is using here. He brings it forth with avowed sympathy, means he agrees with him. He is sympathetic to the argument, meaning he likes the argument. He agrees with the argument. It makes sense to him. Avowed means explicitly expressed. So, Andreski brings forth Bertrand Russell. He adduces him, he brings him forth as evidence with avowed, meaning explicit, agreement. So Andreski agrees with Russell. All right, but let's look at the core of the sentence. The core of the sentence is, Hume and Russell are not sufficient authorities regarding the nature of objectivity. If they are not sufficient authorities, sufficient means good enough. Authorities means they have a right to speak because they know everything. If you consult an authority, you are going to the best source of information, the authoritative source, the source that has the right to speak because it knows. Okay? So, he is saying Hume and Russell are not good enough authorities about the nature of objectivity, especially if they think this. If they think this, they're obviously not sufficient authorities. So we cannot put our trust in their ideas, is what Levis is saying. And the student of English, he says, not the student of philosophy, the student of English, ought to be able to say so. Ought to be able to say that Hume and Russell are not sufficient authorities. Some people would say that that student was proud and uppity and presumptuous to presume to criticize philosophers of the stature of Hume and Russell. But Levis says no. A student of English should be able to criticize Hume and Russell with well-founded conviction. Now, with conviction means they are sure they are right. With well-founded conviction means they can support it with some sort of evidence. Now, I myself am not a student of philosophy, or at least I am not credentialed. I don't have a degree. I have read, I have studied, but I am no authority on philosophy. I'm not even sure I'm an authority on English, to tell you the truth, but with simple logic and clear thinking, it is possible to discover that the ideal of objectivity cannot rest on this distinction, beset by difficulties as it is. So any student of English will be capable of higher thought and will be allowed and justified, allowed to participate in learned conversation with intelligent, well-educated people, even philosophers. So this is Levis's idea, is that the study of English, and he doesn't mean the language, he means the literature, the literary basis of mankind's experience, will fit you even to criticize the likes of Hume with well-founded conviction, because you'll be able to explain why what he's saying cannot be true. Okay, shall we go on to another paragraph? Okay, next paragraph. I touch here on the theme of English as a liaison center, a theme entailing the postulate that the main intellectual disciplines should be co-present in the university, but that a belief in the possible profit of such co-presence is not a belief in mixed courses or in seminars on Wittgenstein for literary students. The presence of philosophy in the university should be important for English. The profit would accrue in the fields of both disciplines. I had better add at once that I cannot think of it as involving, for English, a dependence on authoritative advice from the academic department of philosophy. Before offering to justify this immodest avowal, I will quote another passage from Andreski's chapter and make the commentary it invites. I think we need to look over this paragraph a little more before we move on. Although the quote is closely tied, let's make sure we understand this paragraph. Okay. I touch here on the theme of English. Why does he use the word touch? A touch is light. He doesn't say, I dwell here, which would mean I am examining it comprehensively at great length as my focus. I'm just touching on it. So the main point, we talked for a long, long time about fact and value and objectivity and subjectivity and all that philosophy. And then he tosses off, a student of English is allowed to criticize Hume. He throws it in as an afterthought. A student of English ought to be able to recognize that Hume is not a sufficient authority. Okay, so he touches on it. When I say I touch on something, I mean I only make passing reference. Okay. I touch here on the theme. It is a theme of this book, of English as a liaison center. Okay. Okay, for this whole class, we have been talking about philosophy. We have been talking about objectivity and fact and what underlies objectivity and how to apply it and where the problems are. And then he throws in this line, the student of English ought to be able to see that Hume is not the authority and Russell's not the authority. What he didn't say, the student of French or the student of history or the student of anthropology or the student of economics. He didn't say even the student of philosophy. He said the student of English. Oh, sorry. Sorry again. What's the matter with me? English. He said the student of English should be able to see that Hume is not a sufficient authority on a philosophical topic. I think he also would say that the student of English should be able to see faults in Andreski's sociological research, conclusions that he brings forth, sociology. Or the student of English can see through fallacies in Darwinian science. Or the student of English should be able to evaluate, something else. He is positing, remember I'm using that word, posit? That means suggest. He is positing that English is a center from which a student should be able to reasonably interact with any discipline. This, which he calls a theme of his book, this which he calls a theme of his book is what he just sort of touched on. He threw it out. But it is a vital theme in the idea of English, the living principle. He is saying that the study of English is the basis for all higher thought. And so the student who is well taught in language will be able, without presumption, without putting themselves high in a bad way, to have an opinion about other disciplines. Okay? I touch here on the theme of English as a liaison center. Liaison implies a place where all things meet. All things meet. That means the sociology people have to come in and receive from English in order to go back out to their discipline and to interact with others. The scientists are dependent on English in order to be able to pursue their discipline and also interact with others. So English is the liaison. It's where everyone meets. everyone in all disciplines must be experts in the use and understanding of language, of a rich, subtle language with lots of flexibility to say things with fine shades of meaning. So, English is the liaison, meaning the place where all disciplines meet. It is the center of the hub. Okay? I touch here on the theme that English is the liaison center, a theme entailing the postulate that the main intellectual disciplines should be co-present in a university. Okay, so if this is true, that English is a liaison center for all academic disciplines, then that includes the concept that all these disciplines ought to be co-present. Why does he say co-present? Co-present. Why didn't he just say all of these disciplines should be present in the university? Co implies a connection. If something, say we have a university, and we have a bunch of different disciplines. Maybe they are housed in different buildings. Okay? So here we have the science building, here we have the math building, here we have the sociology building, here we have the history building, here we have the arts building, here we have the English building. In that case, they are all present in the university. Co-present implies something else. Co-present implies a connection where science is not in its own building in the sense that nothing mathematical ever touches it or nothing language-oriented ever touches. That is not the nature of the division. Science coexists and draws from English and other disciplines. All the disciplines interact and draw from one another, enrich one another, support one another. The math department supports the science. The science supports the social sciences. They all support and work together. So co-present implies more than just present, but interacting all together. Especially with English, being present in every single one of them as a foundation. English is the foundation. Okay. So, the theme of English as a liaison center implies that all of the disciplines are co-present in the university. So we have sociology connected to English, connected to science, connected to math. We have philosophy connected to science, connected to logic, connected to English, connected to math, connected to the arts. We have everything everywhere, connections everywhere. And English being the liaison, the place where they all meet and have commerce together. All. Okay? This concept is entailed in this concept. Okay? But that a belief in the possible profit of such co-presence is not a belief in mixed courses or seminars on Wittgenstein for literary students. So, don't get the misunderstanding that what he's saying is that everyone should take everything. All students are required to take 4 years of a foreign language and mathematics through calculus and high-level psychology and sociology and arts courses through advanced skills and all the histories. That would be impossible. That would be absurd. It is not in forcing a student to take specialized courses that you gain this kind of interaction. Somehow there needs to be a synthesis of the aspects of truth across the discipline in all of the disciplines. And the place that it all comes together is English. So we really have a problem, actually, in our educational system with requiring students who are very good in one thing and very bad in another to focus on the thing they're bad at and try to bring it up. Take an art student and require them to take calculus. Or take a math geek and require him to take modern dance. Why should we do this? It's stupid. Take a language person and require her to study statistics. Why do we do this? That's not what he's saying. Okay, so such co-presence is not a belief in mixed courses or in seminars on Wittgenstein for literary students. The presence of philosophy in the university should be important for English. The profit would accrue in the fields of both disciplines. So it doesn't go all one way. When a person studies English, they will begin to have a smattering of logic. They will begin to see how ideas connect. And if a student is hungry for more of that, they can go to the philosophy department and focus on it and study. And then that student will come back to the English department and bring their advanced knowledge into the discussions of literature, thus enriching the English classes. And the philosophy department is enriched by students whose first love of philosophy came from their study of English. So they enrich one another through an exchange back and forth, especially in students who have a desire to go further. And this, of course, will not just be with philosophy, it will be in other disciplines as well, beginning with their knowledge that they gain in their understanding of language. They will tend to pursue that specialized field for which they have an inclination, that specialized field which draws them in their interest. And then they'll bring back to their English interactions a richness of detail and knowledge that they gained from the study of science or from the study of sociology or something. They'll bring it back into their literary discussion and understanding of the people in the books. So there is a commerce between the disciplines which is mutually enriching, even though you aren't forcing people to take courses outside of their specialized interest. Except, of course, they all have to begin with English. And not only English, it could be Portuguese. It's the study of language. Okay. Okay, the profit would accrue in the fields of both disciplines. Accrue meaning stack up profits, accumulate. I had better add at once that I cannot think of it as involving, for English, a dependence on authoritative advice from the academic department of philosophy. Because that's where you have people like Hume. In other words, English is not depending on the experts over here to tell English what to think. English is capable of thinking on its own and is willing to be enriched by the perspectives offered by philosophy, but will stand outside as discerning consumer or critic. And in the same way, English does not inquire of sociology in order to understand what's happening in a book like The Lord of the Flies or The Jungle. We don't rely on the specialized disciplines to tell us what to think about a book or about human nature or about the emotions experienced by characters. Rather, we come to original perspectives, original impressions from reading, and then we seek it out further through the study of the discipline of sociology. Yet, always bringing checks and balances even to the discipline. So, Levis absolutely disavows, so that's like, he says he does not agree. To avow means to explicitly say something. So to disavow is to explicitly deny something. He explicitly denies that the specialized disciplines are above English and in authority. In medicine, if you have a disease, you go to a general doctor and he says, "Oh, that looks bad. I will send you to a specialist." And then the specialist is the authority because he has studied it more. And if the specialist says, "This is cancer," the general doctor will usually say, "Oh, you must be right." That is not the case in Levis's idea of the university. These people are not specialists in the sense that they have more right to speak than the student here. The student here is entitled to his opinion, and it must be respected. And these people's opinions are not necessarily better. That's what Levis says. Okay. So, I had better add at once that I cannot think of it as involving, for English, a dependence on authoritative advice from the academic department of philosophy. Before offering to justify this immodest avowal, I will quote another passage from Andreski's chapter and make commentary. Okay, so what I have just explained is his immodest avowal. Immodest means he is not humble. Modesty is humility. Modesty is self-effacing. Modesty takes a low place. To be modest, you might say, "Teach me, sir, what I should think, because you are brilliant." That would be modest. Andreski is being immodest, according to himself, when he says, "You can't teach me anything. You philosophers don't know any more than my English students. My English students have the right to original ideas in your field." That is immodest. Most people would say that the specialist is on top, the generalist is on bottom. And when he says, "No, the generalist is paramount and these other specialists are just optional," that's immodest. He feels he has to justify it. He is going to have to prove it through some way. So he is going to prove it later, but first he is going to quote another passage from Andreski's chapter. And now we will take a break. We will not come back in 5 minutes because you aren't there yet. And so if you have questions, send them in. You can speak Portuguese or English. And I will see you next week. Please write 1 or 2 paragraphs explaining what you understand to be the argument from the beginning. Look back, remind yourself. What are we talking about? Where are we going? Send it in soon so that I can look it over and we will talk about it next week. See you then.